What is good, y'all? It is your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer with the Playmakers Corner podcast. And today we got even more previews for y'all here. We're going to talk about some teams in the metro area. We're going to talk about some powerhouse 3A teams up north. And then I'm going to shift gears into 2A as well on this episode, as well as any future episodes, is kind of dipping down in classification, at least on my end. We're going to have some previews from Gideon and Gino up ahead, as well as previews from Coach V in the past. Go ahead and listen to all of those for full analysis on every program in Colorado. But if you want to know how we assess these programs, it is by talking about last year's performance, seniors that graduated, returning playmakers, and then projecting into next season here. And we got a great example here, or we have an example, I should say, with Hinkley here from Aurora, Colorado. Now, Hinkley here has dropped significantly in classification over the past few years. They are now going to be competing in the 3A Metro division here. And the significance of that is that they obviously take a notch down from 4A here. And in addition to that, I just want to say that filling in the gaps as far as some of the teams that will be playing in that division, in the Metro 3A division, I am covering Hinkley as well as Kennedy, but some of the other schools that I don't have are the likes of Holy Family, Littleton, Lutheran, and Stanley Lake. So go ahead and find those season previews amongst Coach V's season. I actually think he has all four of those, now that I think about it for 2 seconds. I think that Coach V has all of those. So go ahead and find his 3A Frenzy episode. But let's go ahead and talk about the Thunder here. Last year's recap, I put down that I don't see them winning a lot of games, or winning a game even, is what Coach V said. And, that's kind of all you need to know from their preview last year, is they did go 0-10. They only scored in half of their games, and Aurora Central was one of their closer games, losing 34-15. All their other games were basically blowouts, except they only lost to Thornton by 1 point, 7-6. So looking at some of the players that graduate who contributed last year, stats were barely tracked for offense and defense in just 5 games. But according to those stats, they are losing their leading sack artists, Jeffrey Peak and Lawrence Morris. Peak, or Peaches, 9 sacks and 6 hurries, being one of the lone bright spots on the stat sheet here. And as far as returning playmakers go, keep in mind that the top 3 tacklers, according to these incomplete stats, all return. And then you got to bounce back, losing tacklers 4 through 7. But one of those playmakers is going to be Marcus Yarbrough here, who is followed by Gabriel Ocampo, and those two have 70 total tackles in 5 listed games. And they might also benefit from Villalobos here, who as a sophomore had 23 tackles on the defensive end. The offensive stats just weren't good enough to really invest a lot of time into, if I'm being completely honest here. And so, got to meet us halfway here, got to put in stats no matter how bad they are, and get that taken care of. So with that in mind, let's look ahead to this year's schedule here, where they play at Timnath and then at home versus Aurora Central versus Kent Denver, and then head into league play, Kennedy, Lutheran, Stanley Lake, Holy Family, and Littleton here. Prior to the Timnath game, they have Inglewood and Skyview to start the season. And honestly, I am just going to rip it off here and say that the window of wins for Hinkley is not going to change of 0-2. At least not from anything that I've heard or any rumblings that might result in a massive culture shift. I think that Inglewood is going to be in flux. They do have a new coach, so potentially that is a game that maybe you can win. Skyview has some returning talent from last season, and they were somewhat successful last year. Timnath does have athletes in interesting spots, and they got a win last year. And you have to go on the road all the way up there for that game. I don't think that Timnath is worse than Hinkley, honestly, but I think it's a winnable game. Aurora Central, honestly, just to kind of speed run through the rest of these, I don't really see them having a chance at winning a game until maybe at home versus Littleton High School, because I do know that they're losing some guys, but they're also returning a handful of athletes here, and I don't know. It's just hard to tell. I feel bad for Hinkley here. I think that they have just gotten the short end of the stick as far as attendance goes and participation and just investment, maybe a little bit. From the resources that they have. I obviously always want to see these A-Town squads do very well, but Hinkley just doesn't seem like the bus is going to turn around anytime soon here for the Rolling Thunder. Now, a team that also kind of had a tougher season, but one that I'm kind of optimistic about heading into the future is Kennedy. Last season I gave them a window of wins of 0-3, and they ended up going 2-8 with one of the more unforgiving schedules I saw from any 3A team, with the likes of facing Mesa Ridge, Roosevelt, Bear Creek, and George Washington for their out-of-league schedule. Now, obviously, I think that if you look at that and look at this team last year, you think that G-Dub was maybe one of their more likely to win games, but they unfortunately just kind of skid there before getting a win against Littleton. And then the league was just incredibly tough with the likes of Northfield, Fort Morgan, Lutheran, and Holy Family. Yeah, that's 3 playoff teams and 2 of the teams that were in state all taking turns running amok. But in between there was a massive 50-0 win over Lincoln High School. And so talking about some of the commanders that helped command this squad in the class of 24, I got to talk about the 2 leading receivers from last year. They almost combined for 1,000 yards, being Isaiah Rodriguez and Noah Herrera. They also made up 11 of the team's 14 receiving touchdowns. So that is just a lot of production to lose. And you go from 2 options to however many come back in tow with high volume here. They also lose Adrian Cruz. He was the premier defender on this team, and that leaves a massive gap in tackles or prime opportunity for someone to step up, as he was above and away the Iron Man of the squad, playing in every game and recording over 100 total tackles with a few in the backfield. Not to mention, the stats at least list that he blocked 5 field goals, which is crazy, and recovering 3 fumbles. He was responsible for nearly half of the Commanders' total turnovers on the defensive side of the ball. So not a ton of graduates, but very high impact guys here that are departing. But the returning Playmakers does have me a little bit more excited for the future of Kennedy football here. You get the return of Isaiah Tomita, who led the team in attempts and yards with over 800 passing yards last season, but was also backed up by Marco Rodriguez, who got in limited time as a sophomore. So hopefully that was some valuable experience, and they have a little bit of depth at the quarterback position. Isaac Trujillo was the leading ball carrier, going for over 400 yards and a few scores, while also notching another 143 yards catching the football. So somebody who could be potentially a dual threat out of the backfield and help this offense keep chains moving and keep the ball moving. Other receivers who made an impact included the leader in receptions, who is Craig Johnson here, led at 37 catches here. And they also bring back Cruz Holmes, who averaged over 15 yards per reception with 17 catches in just half a season of action. Up in the trenches here, you have a class of 26 sophomores, Ian Martinez and Xavier Agosto here, or I should say incoming juniors here, who as sophomores were 2 linemen that made an impact here and will look on to add on size and mass up front for that offensive line. You look at the defense, and another sophomore pops up here, Justin Lopez. He made an impact getting to the quarterback with 8 sacks and could really help the rest of the defense with opportunities by forcing pressure. He also had a class of 27 contributor Uriah Garcia here, only a freshman, but came in at about 200 pounds and was pressuring the quarterback and could, with some more experience, with some more agility work, with some more strength, hopefully convert a handful of those hurries into sacks. Now, the defense did not force a lot of turnovers here, but Holmes, Tomita, and Johnson all come back with an interception, and Ian Martinez recovered a fumble, so they do still have over half of the total turnovers coming back, albeit not as much turnover power as you would probably hope here. And so looking ahead to this schedule here, it's a pretty interesting schedule for Kennedy here. I still don't know if this is necessarily a playoff team, but it should be a team that competes a little bit more. I think that they probably lose to Moffat County here. You'll hear about that squad a little bit later, but their high-end talent I think is just a little bit higher than Kennedy's. So, and they have one of the bigger regions to have football players from, so there's that. They then face Pomona at home. That is going to be a very interesting game. This is Pomona's first season in 3A, as they dropped all the way from 5A to the 3A classification here. I assume that they're going to be way more competitive in this classification and hopefully find an identity at this level here. But, they have consistency. Their coach has been there for a while. They have like a culture. in ways. And so I do think that that is a game where Pomona should be favored. Now, Bennett's a very interesting squad, as they had one of the more brutalizing schedules last year, but we know exactly what Bennett is. And Kennedy, I mean, it just depends on who you get to replace a guy like Adrian Cruz, a linebacker who can play against this kind of wing T kind of deal and, push back against it a little bit. But I think that Bennett is going to have a handful of ball carriers who do come back despite leading their leading guy. I still think that this is kind of an offense that's meant to kind of sustain. And a lot of those younger guys that were on the defensive side of the ball take a step forward this season. So unfortunately, I think that is not a win. Lincoln High School, on the other hand, I think that this is probably a W for Kennedy and one of the ones that I was projecting from last year. And then they end their non-league play against Highlands Ranch. That is a 4A squad, if I'm not mistaken here. But another team that got a ton of snaps against 5A competition last year. That's going to be a tough game. I don't think it's an automatic loss, but I'm going to chalk it up to a loss for now. Then they face Hinkley. I think that they should win that game. And then the rest of their league, Holy Family, Littleton, Stanley Lake, Lutheran here. I think that they don't fare super well. I don't think that they beat a Holy Family, a Stanley Lake, or a Lou High. I do think that they can beat a Littleton potentially. So yeah, that's kind of where I sit with this squad here. And yeah, if you look at it, that means that I have them projected going about 2-8 here. But I do think that there's a window of wins here of 2-4. I have them going 3-7. My bad. So that's a 3-7 record, which would be one better than last year. But really, I think that they could potentially win as many as 5 here. But I'm going to say 3-7 overall and call it a window of wins of 3-5 here, as this could be a big year for Kennedy as they continue to establish stuff. And with this sophomore class that they have going, maybe build towards something truly special here in about a season. Up next, we got a very familiar program here on our season previews here. That being the Fort Morgan Mustangs here, just state champs a few years ago here. And, I thought that this team was going to be a little bit ahead of schedule, if you would, as far as their rebuild goes and kind of just getting some of these young guys to be ready here. And I just kind of overestimated a little bit how far along they would be. I put my window of wins at 4-6 and projected my record at 4-6 as well. They ended up going 2-8, but playing some interesting games. They lost by Coniford 2-11 to start the season. I'm sure that's a game that they would want back. They then lost at home to Brush by 3, and I know that the Stangs at the end of that season would want that game back as well. They would then lose to Roosevelt, Pueblo County, and Frederick, who are all postseason or fringe squads to head into League 0-5. But then they flash what they are building towards, beating Lincoln and Kennedy with a combined score of 76-0 before losing to 3 playoff teams to close the season. Now, there are going to be a couple of class of 24 guys here. I'm talking about Charlie Langford, huge stud here, going for 800 yards and 9 scores, leaving a vacuum of yards and receptions and scores for others to fill. Defensively, he also had 49 tackles and led the team with 4 interceptions. That's going to be a big one for this defense to replace here. And on other contributors here, Carson Roth, Oscar Ramirez, and Langford were tacklers 2-4 last season, accounting for over 150 combined tackles, as well as 18 TFLs, with Roth and Ramirez going for 11 and 7 respectively, and Oscar here going for 5 sacks. But a lot of these contributors from that squad last year will be returning. I wish that there was more film on all of these guys, because I do think that there's something special brewing here, and I wish I got to break it down analytically just a little bit more here. But some of the guys who are coming back, especially at the receiver position, that intrigue me are the likes of Angel Lopez here. He was second in yards and receptions at 32 receptions and 455 yards. He also had freshman phenom Dawson Call, who logged 148 yards and 4 touchdowns with a 6'1" frame. He can end up being one of the best Stang receiving threats in a while. You also look at Samson Ortega, who is the leading ball carrier in yards with 696. And if he could become a dual threat RB, that could be the next dimension that this offense needs, kind of similar to, I'm assuming, how his older brother Frank Ortega was. Now, a pair of sophomores in Fritzler and Underwood also combined for 200 yards, and that can turn into a bit of a flexible kind of by committee approach here with Fritzler, who actually led in scores with 4 touchdowns in here. And so you have like 3 different guys who can run the ball. But I don't think that these guys get the same opportunities if it wasn't for J.J. Marquez, who in his sophomore effort showed some serious promise, throwing for over 1,800 yards and 19 touchdowns. He did throw a handful of picks. I want to say like 11 of them. And losing his leading receiver definitely stinks. But I think that JJ has the build and potential to really take major strides along with his coaching staff maximizing him. Returning to the defense, you do have leading tackler Noah Aguirre here. He had 120 with 9 of those being in the backfield and was just an absolute game wrecker, notching 4 sacks as well. Wyatt Patterson and Dominic Vasquez were both juniors with 40-plus tackles, with Patterson notching 4 tackles for loss, and both dudes had sacks last season. And then also you had Angel Lopez, Aguirre, and Isaiah Ortiz here, who all had a pair of interceptions. And while Langford did have a team-high 10 pass breakups here, Angel Lopez and Yeteli Busanera here were at a combo of 13 pass breakups and had a couple more for some other returners that have been mentioned prior. So, this Fort Morgan squad, I think they could be pretty interesting this year, but the question is, can they put it all together, and how will this new league that's a little bit closer to the old league kind of treat them? And they have a pretty interesting schedule here. Let's go ahead and talk about it here. First off, they go down to Pueblo. They actually have 3 straight road games to start, which is pretty wild here with the likes of Pueblo East, Brush, and Lutheran. These are not great matchups, honestly, to start, with all of them being on the road here. And so I'm going to say that they do start 0-3, but they then get Skyview at home. I do think this is a winnable game and one that they should sneak away. They then face Eaton here, and on paper, I want to say that they should beat this Eaton squad, but, this Eaton squad is also very well coached. They have some people returning, and, I just kind of know what Eaton looks like a little bit more because of the film that's available and because of what they were able to accomplish in 2A, and they face 3A teams like this somewhat often here, so I am going to give the edge to Eaton in this one. They then play Mountain View here. Mountain View was a very young team as well last year, but I think that Fort Morgan, I just kind of trust this program a little bit more with what they've accomplished historically to win this game. And so that puts them at a, 2-4 record heading into their biggest game of their season. It always is, but this one they could actually, I think, compete in for the first time in a few years here. I think both these teams are kind of in a similar spot as far as the kind of players that are returning, as far as the kind of talent that they're bringing in. And, just developmentally, they'll be way closer this year than they have been in a few years, and that is versus Roosevelt in Fort Morgan. This was one of the best games that I ever attended, honestly, in the history of the podcast, back when Brock Saya was the quarterback at Roosevelt, and back when Briggs Wheatley and Frank Ortega were doing their thing prior to winning state, facing off against Roosevelt. They did lose a heartbreaker at home. They're trying to snap this losing streak that has gone back a few years here. Do I think that they'll do it? Not entirely sure. I have Roosevelt favored in this game, but if not now, then when is kind of where I'm on with that. Against Thompson Valley, I do actually think that at this point in the season, Fort Morgan is going to be hungry, and they could get a win there. Then against Pomona here, Pomona, their biggest strength is their secondary here, and I think that this is going to be a game that really tests J.J. Marquez and sees where he's at here. But I don't know if Pomona has any offensive firepower to really fill the void there, so I am going to favor Fort Morgan initially in this one. And then versus Severance, this is going to be a good game here near the end of the season, and I think that Fort Morgan should be favored here. I think that Severance has some better high-end talent coming into this matchup, but Fort Morgan at home, in addition, I think that Ian Pennick is going to have quite the wear and tear, being the primary kind of offensive HUD of this Severance team. And so I think that just kind of favors Fort Morgan at this point in the season, that just has like a few more weapons and a few more guys to pick up carries here that should keep them just a little bit more fresh this late in the season. Now, I've obviously said that a couple of these could go either way. I think that a lot of these squads kind of in this league are definitely up for. I think that this league is kind of not entirely up for grabs. I think that Roosevelt is the favorite here, but there's a lot of interesting movement. You had a 5A team that's coming down to 3A. You have a Thompson Valley squad that's coming off a historic year, but losing one of their best players in Riley Suarez. You have Severance, who graduates a really, really good quarterback who's going to the D2 level here, as well as losing some other playmaking options here. And so for this Fort Morgan squad, I think they got to do better than 2 wins that they did last year. I think that this team has to win 3 games in this season here. They could only win 2. I will put that as their absolute floor. But on the high end of things, I mean, I think that you could argue 3, 4, 5, 6 wins are probably possible. Huge window of wins. I don't normally like to do a window of wins of this big, but like I said, I just don't have any film on this team, so I really don't know what to think about them and where they're going to end up falling in this season. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 2 to 6, but I don't know if I'm going to regret this because I said it last year, but I'm going to say 4 and 6 is going to be their overall record here, but just a huge window of wins here because, I mean, what are we looking at? What are we looking at? How much better are they getting in the offseason? Are they a bit more consistent on offense? Are they a bit more fundamental on defense? Do some of these young guys take the strides that they're supposed to take? Or are they 2 years out from being a powerhouse? Not entirely sure. So that is the Mustangs season preview. Now, I'm sure the guys who are doing their homework extensively right now are their rivals here, the Roosevelt Rough Riders here. Let's go ahead and talk about last season and look ahead to this season. Look, we knew that they were returning a ton of talent from their state squad just a couple of years ago, and we're going to be solid and make another run of sorts, and they did exactly that, going 8-2 in the regular season with some signature wins against the likes of Fort Morgan, 5A Highlands Ranch, Holy Family at home, the eventual state champs, mind you, Northridge, and an instant classic 28-27 win over Severance. But they seemed susceptible this season more so than the prior season with a 40-20 loss to Res Christian and a 41-21 loss to Thompson Valley. This would be more than enough to make the playoffs, though, and they made a statement in the opening round running rampant on Riverdale Ridge before losing in the next round 40-21 to a stacked 1 seed of Green Mountain here. And this would unfortunately be the end of a very special era of Roosevelt and even Colorado high school football. Talking about the likes of Bronco Hartson as well as his running mate Xavier Ramirez at running back here. Both of those guys taking their talents to the west side over at Mesa here. Bronco Hartson, a fringe top 5 senior quarterback with our grading system. One of the more accomplished players in Colorado football, a 2-year starter, a state champion, a massive boost of touchdowns here. And Xavier Ramirez, X here, like Weapon X, whatever you want to call him, the X Factor, he ran like crazy through different lines and found success and was able to make moves on second and even third levels. One of our top 5 senior running backs here. This duo combined for 47 touchdowns and almost 4,000 yards last year of offense. Now, I obviously have a ton of faith in Coach over there, but that's still a lot of production to replace here. You also, on top of that, maybe to a lesser extent, but in addition to, have to replace the likes of Joey Brake. He caught 4 touchdowns and almost 400 yards as the leading class of 24 receiving threat. And defensively, you lose Jace Guntel, 4.5 sacks, 50 tackles, and 11 for loss, being amongst the best on the defense, only behind Broncos' 55 total tackles in the 24 class. Now, the reason that it's not time to panic, offensively, losing a lot. Defensively, this team was a lot younger last year, and you could see some of those struggles in those games where they lost. Every game that they lost, their opponent scored over 40 points. That's just not a great formula for winning, but hopefully a lot of these guys take that step forward, and this defense kind of tightens up. I'm looking at the likes of Noel Sanchez here, leading tackler on the squad as a junior with 91 total, and is one of the top 3 tacklers returning to the fold. And in addition, he had 14 TFLs, and this defense, I think, will be the strong suit of this squad here. They're usually pretty balanced here, but, maybe some years where they're not as successful on offense. That's where they fall short in the playoffs, or maybe their defense allows just a few too many points. I mean, in 3A, it's really a chess match every single drive. So who can say what the exact causes are? But in addition to the defense coming back here, you get Jax Armstrong and Evan Hayes. They were the next two tacklers with 82 and 59 respectively, in addition to 7 and 4 TFLs. As class of 26 representatives, the freshman class saw some dogs. I'm looking at Kason Lopez, who had 8 tackles for loss, and Noah Lucero, who had 3 interceptions. You also bring back Trevor Carabench here, who is tied for the lead in INTs with 3 of his own and led the team in pass deflections with 8. Tristan Montanez here notched double-digit TFLs, being one of the better D linemen here. You also have Aiden Henry, who is up there with 7 TFLs, Carter Harmon here, who had 4 TFLs in limited snaps, and a freshman in Michael Garcia, who got in there for 3 tackles for loss. Offensively here, it will be interesting because I think that they have an incoming senior quarterback who could be a stopgap guy. But if he is eligible, you will also have Jackson Dart, former Timnath kid, competing for snaps there. Now, whoever does win this position here will get the benefit of Trevor Carabench and Noah Lucero, both returning. These receivers combined for over 1,000 yards and 12 total touchdowns, so they'll get some consistency at that position. You also have Luke Vigil here. I think he's going to take over as the primary running back here, as he had 335 yards and 4 scores, but they do a good job of making a ton of players very versatile and utilizing very good two-way players. So who's to say one of these big defensive contributors doesn't get a few more snaps on offense this season heading into this new look 3A. And this team is going to be very tested very early here, as to start their schedule, they play at Northfield versus Holy Family, at Ponderosa, at Rifle, and versus Windsor to start the year here. That is a lot of travel, honestly, especially I'm looking at that week 4 game where they will be going to Rifle, Colorado. That is quite a bus trip. And yeah, on top of that, Ponderosa going all the way down to Parker as well is going to be interesting. Now, I think that this team should go 3-2 over this stretch. I really do. I think that I have them favored over Northfield at home versus Holy Family. It's a tough play to play in Johnstown. Another key thing that I look at for their postseason loss was that it was on the road, so that's something else to consider. Holy Family, that was one of their losses last year, was against Roosevelt in Johnstown here, so I think that that gives them a little bit of a boost here. Holy Family going through a lot of revolution as well, so I just think that, you know, Roosevelt has a little bit more consistency, and I have faith in Coach Lane over there to take care of the offense and at least get them far enough along to win some of these games. Rifle is graduating a ton. Valencia could be a problem, but this defense is the one that's returning a ton of the talent. I don't think that they beat Ponderosa on the road, and Windsor, I think, is still the favorite in 3A, at least according to our preseason power rankings. Check those out on our social medias, by the way. But that is the league play, or the non-league play, and then heading into league, you know, I hinted that Fort Morgan might have a chance here, but I did say I still have Roosevelt favored to win this league, and I do think that there's a chance that they go 5-0. I think at worst, you can't do any worse than 3-2 against this league. I think that if you're Roosevelt, you have to beat a Mountain View, you have to beat a Severance. I think that you have to get your get back for Thompson Valley as well last year. Maybe losing to Pomona or Fort Morgan, but I mean, this is a team that's very familiar with most of these opponents. They're not going to be worried about Pomona coming down from 5A. They're playing a 4A team, a playoff 4A team, mind you, in Ponderosa. That's actually a really interesting game, and one that if I could, I would probably try and make it, but that is earlier in the season, so don't know about that one so much. But anyways, this is quite the schedule here, and honestly, I think that 7-3 or 8-2 is not, you're not asking for too much. I think that if you win less than 6 games, that's a bit of a disappointment. And if you win more than 8 games, that is above expectation. So I'm going to say 6-8 or 6-8 for the window of wins, but I'm actually going to say 8-2 for the overall record. I know this team. They've been relevant this entire time. I know this staff. I know a lot of these players that they're bringing back. I got eyes on them twice last year at the Riverdale Ridge and Green Mountain game. Coach V and Gideon got eyes at them at the Severance game here, and a lot of these young guys made high-impact plays, and now it's their turn to take over, and I do have faith that the Rough Riders will continue to be a successful and prestigious program on the Colorado high school football level in 3A or just on any level. And now comes one of our more interesting assessments here, and that is going to be the Pomona Panthers, who, as I've mentioned just a couple of times, do go from the 5A classification to the 3A classification. Not really sure how this crazy downsizing of this school has gone on, honestly. But, glad to see that they're competing, and honestly, probably just going to be a little bit better for morale and whatnot, and just better matchups as well. So Pomona here, they dipped below my wow of 2-4, losing an unexpected one to me, to Thomas Jefferson to start the year. And after Legend, they lost a heartbreaking game to Loveland 27-26, my bad. They then dropped by 10 to Fountain Fort Carson, and then continued their skid through league before finally pulling out a 3-point win over Lakewood to close the season. As far as graduated seniors goes, it kind of looks like Dalton Hansen was one of the only players who threw passes last season and will be graduating. But as far as returning playmakers go, you have the likes of Emmett Munson, who might be the primary option under center, complementing some passes and led in rushing along with his partner in crime, Louis Santana here, who had 199 yards, strengthening a ground game. You also have Bauer Suazo here, who led in receiving yards and comes back. But I'm looking at this defense that's going to be the unit that makes this Pomona team special on the 3A level here. Like a Noah Sanchez, 82 tackles, led a defense that returns the majority of contributors. I'm looking at Connor Craver, who is second on the team with 64 tackles and 6 of those for loss. I'm looking at Isaiah Hawkins here, 60 tackles, and led the team in TFLs at 10 his junior year, along with 3 sacks and 14 hurries, being a huge force in the pass rush. I'm looking at Michael Tischler here, 43 tackles, 2 of those for loss. I'm looking at Julian Garcia's TFLs and Maddox Nahara's 5 TFLs, 5 hurries, and 2 sacks here. This defense is going to cause some problems here, and they have a very interesting schedule that kind of dips between the 3 and 4A level here. And I think that this team is going to be, I'm excited to see how the 3A level fits them. And so to start off the season, they play Kennedy. I think this is a team that Pomona should probably win. But, I don't know if first thing out the gate, Kennedy might have some tricks up their sleeve or what they've been able to develop on offense, because the offense is definitely going to be a problem for Pomona this season, I think. And so then they hop on down south to Pueblo West. I think this is a win for Pueblo West. They then play Green Mountain. Green Mountain, as far as Green Mountain's defense versus Pomona's defense, I do think that Green Mountain brings back some higher-end talent, while Pomona probably has some more depth. But I am going to favor Green Mountain over there and see what new coach cooks up in the kitchen for that offense. Versus Dakota Ridge, I think that this is also a win for Dakota Ridge. And then versus Wheat Ridge, this is a very interesting game here. But, I think I'm going to give the edge to the offensively powered Farmers here over the defensively powered Panthers here. And so, but I think that's a winnable game. So I'd say a wow of 1-2 in non-league play. Once it gets to league play against Roosevelt, I do think that Roosevelt should be favored in that game, just what they're bringing back on both sides of the ball. But then versus Severance, this is a game that they could win. Severance is going to run the ball a lot this year. And so this could be a game that literally ends like 10-6 or 10-7 or 13-10. And, I don't think that Pomona really minds that. I think that that's a game that they're comfortable playing and a game that they're going to be comfortable winning as well. So that's something to keep in mind. They then go to Mountain View. Gosh, they really have to travel for a handful of these. They then go up to Mountain View and Loveland and then end the season versus Fort Morgan and then at Thompson Valley. Fort Morgan returning a lot more talent on both sides of the ball, but if this secondary and this defense can force J.J. Marquez to make a lot of mistakes, that is a winnable game here. And Thompson Valley is going to have someone new under center as well. So I think that on the low end of things, I think that Pomona, they should still win 3 games, honestly. I said that a lot of these can kind of go one way or the other, and I stand by that. But, I think that it is worth mentioning that this team offensively, I just don't know what they're going to do. And so if it turns into if there's another team that can score very fast, that is going to be very bad for this team's chances to win. I mean, I'm looking at a Pueblo West with a guy like Gavin Lockett probably being able to score 14 points in like 5 plays. I'm looking at a Dakota Ridge that's always a super explosive offense and probably will continue to be. I'm looking at Wheat Ridge with some of the best skill players on the 3A level. I'm looking at Roosevelt, who has some great skill players. Granted, not a quarterback necessarily yet, but what good is the other team's offense not moving the ball going to do if your offense doesn't really have any answers here? So I'm actually going to bump down the window of wins from 3 to 2 on the lower end of things. And I think that at best they win like, let's say that they go crazy in league. I mean, 5. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 2 to 5 and say an overall prediction of 4 and 6. I'll say that they finish on the higher end of that, but some serious work needs to be done for the offense to bridge this gap here heading into the 3A classification. And now we move from the 3A to the 2A level here. Going to talk about the Aspen Skiers. They're just like me for real. And talk about what happened last year. And last year they started off 0-3 with close losses to Glenwood Springs, Gunnison, and then a tough loss to Meeker here. The Skiers bounced back, winning 3 in a row, 42-21 over Steamboat. They won big over Coal Ridge and Grand Valley here before dropping their last 3 games to playoff teams Rifle, Moffat County, and Basalt. That is a brutal stretch to end the season here. And so that's obviously going to put kind of a sour taste in your mouth, but those are the teams that you're going to have to beat in order to make the postseason. And so Aspen here, they're going to have to do so without a couple of guys here. Tanner Benson being a huge cog in the machine, passing for over 1,800 yards and rushing for another 500, which was a team high, going for over 20 combined scores. And defensively, they lose Eli Kissel here, 60 tackles, being second on the team. But really, Tanner Benson is that huge impact under center that they will be missing. But whoever is under center next year will benefit from a very experienced receiver room. I'm looking at Henry Hurd at tight end, who is a D1 talent. He caught 13 touchdowns here, as well as another 800 yards through the air. You also bring back Landon Thurber, almost 700 receiving yards, and had another 3 receiving touchdowns for this offense. Palmes and Kuhlman both had over 100 yards, rounding out every triple-digit receiver. Then Dylan Mika was only a sophomore, leading this team in carries and rushing scores, collecting 6 on the ground and going for almost 1,000 yards. Thurber also was a leader in the squad in tackles and is joined by 3 other juniors who had over 30 tackles in Andrew Palmes, Schlesinger Hall, and Henry Hurd. So just returning like a handful of very high-end talent here, or at least for this squad in comparison to last year. Let's go ahead and take a look at their schedule here, where they start off at home versus Grand Valley. This should be a game that they win. I also like their odds in week 2 against Steamboat Springs. Summit is a team that is losing a bit of talent from last year, but this is a team that is super hard to count out year in and year out. They just find a way to compete in that Frisco area, even going 4-6 last year against a really, really tough schedule here. But I do think if there was ever a time to pull off a win against Summit, it would be this year, where like anybody who was anybody scoring the ball is gone. So I will favor Aspen to start off 3-0, but then they travel all the way to the metro area against Kent Denver. I don't think that is a win here. Middle Park the next week could be a very interesting game. This is a Friday night game in Granby at 7 p.m. I think that game really could go either way. I will talk about Middle Park at the end of this episode, so just stick around here. But both these teams kind of in a similar spot. I actually think Middle Park, I might favor them just because I know who their quarterback is and I like what they got going on there. But as far as like spread of talent goes, Aspen's is way more spread out around different areas, different positions, and different sides of the ball. So that is one thing that Aspen has going for them that could definitely win them this game. Against Moffat County, I do think that this is a win for Moffat County. First off, it is in Craig, Colorado, so that is something that is going to help out the Bulldogs quite a bit. And I just think I kind of like the high-end talent for Moffat County just a little bit more on both sides of the ball. They then face defending state champions Delta. This game is at home, but I still think Delta is set to roll here before they get Coal Ridge that they should be, and then at Basalt. I actually think that is going to be a loss here. So if I count out their total losses for kind of like 4 to 5, it kind of looks like here. So I think that that's a good window of wins here for Aspen as far as like, and it's like any of these games, I don't really know if they steal any of these crazy upset games, but they might drop one of these games that they should win. So I'll say a window of wins of 3 to 5, but I'm going to put them at a projected record of 5-4. And this might be good enough to make the postseason with how tough their league could be this year. I mean, if you're looking at Moffat, Delta, and Basalt, who all made the postseason last year, and if you play them well enough and take care of business against everybody else and go 5-4, including against a Kent Denver team that's going to be seeded very, very high, that could be enough to get into the postseason. You just have to show up and make sure that you put points on the board against these teams. Speaking of these teams here, we do have the Basalt Longhorns up next on this preview here. Let's go and talk about their season last year. You know, in classic Basalt fashion, they rattled off 7 wins in the season, made the playoffs, and unfortunately lost in the first round. Their losses on the season were to Rifle and Moffat County, both playoff teams, and then TCA in the postseason. Some of their notable wins were over Eagle Valley, Buena Vista, Glenwood Springs, and their 60-pointer over Aspen here. As far as graduating seniors go, you do lose your starting quarterback in Noah Johnson, who was under center last season and threw 13 scores. And he was also second on the team in tackles behind only Mav Dombrowski here. These two guys got a combined 5 TFLs. You also lose Gage Balderson here, 4th on the team in tackles and 2nd in TFLs with 6. You also look at Dombrowski and Balderson's impact in the passing game, and they were both tied for the team lead in interceptions with 3 apiece. And you also lose Paul Schenk here, who was the leader in sacks and TFLs with 6 and 9 respectively. Nice. So nice play by those seniors there. But as far as returners go, this team is going to run the ball very well. And they're not thinking about how they're going to do that because they return their top 3 rushers, their trio of rushers here. Will Tarallo, William Daniel, and Taylor Hayes here. And with those with the dubs up front, Will and William here, Tarallo and Daniel here, they accounted for over 2,000 yards, with Daniel punching it in 21 times. Combine that with Hayes' ability to impact the game in multiple ways with almost 300 yards and 10 receiving scores. This team was built with skill position players, and they're going to continue to make a huge impact this year. Not to mention, you got to bring back Dylan Johnston, 400 plus all-purpose yards with over 200 return yards. I assume he's going to get some more touches on the offensive side of the ball to try and fill some voids left by seniors here. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball. William Daniel was actually the leading non-senior tackler with 57 total tackles. You also get Kodey Barton, who comes back his junior year after notching 3 TFLs. And Hayes on defense had 3 INTs, which, if you recall, is tied for the team lead, as well as 4 pass breakups. So fueled by some of their fantastic, almost classic athletes at this point, Basalt is probably due for another good season. So let's take a look at the Longhorn season here. They start off versus Arvada. This should be a win. They then play at Rifle. This is going to be a huge game to determine where they're at because Rifle is losing quite a bit of really good talent here. This could be a chance for Basalt to make a statement. I just don't know if I necessarily trust them in these games, though. So I will favor Rifle in that game. Versus Glenwood Springs, I think this is one that Basalt wins. You know, Glenwood Springs does have Markovich. I think that he's very special, but as far as other contributors on the team, did not leave me going crazy necessarily following the game that I saw from them last year. They then play Evergreen at Evergreen. Now, Coach V is a little, he does a full preview on Evergreen, and he has some mixed thoughts on this team as to what they can be and maybe what they should be here. I think if this turns into a runoff here, I think that I am going to favor Basalt. They could lose this on the road and still be fine, but I think that they will beat 3A Evergreen here. They then play Delta the following week. I don't necessarily know if Basalt's ready to beat a team of Delta's caliber here, but if they beat Delta, they should win this league. Like, if I'm being completely honest, that's the top dog or the top cat in this instance that you got to knock down. So if you're going to do it, that's the time. But I think in Delta is just going to be a hard place to play, and it definitely just favors the Panthers a little bit more. They then face Coal Ridge at home as well as Moffat County here. Now, they lost to Moffat County last year, but Moffat County has a lot to replace from last year. They do have some really good playmakers coming back, but I think that this game actually favors Basalt here. And so that combined with the games against Middle Park and Aspen down the stretch, I think that this realistically should be I think this should be at least a 7-win season. At worst, it's 6. At best, it's 8. So I'm going to say a window of wins for this Basalt squad of 6 to 8. They are consistently good in the regular season. I think that's going to continue here, and I'm going to project them to have a 7-2 regular season record. We're now on to a program that I think has seen some steady improvement since first covering them here. Looking at Coal Ridge as far as like inputting stats and just putting forth an effort here a little bit out of Newcastle, Colorado. I think that, I knew last year that this team was going to struggle, but they did get a win in week 7 over Grand Valley, 20-13, to give them a bright spot on a long season, but they competed, throughout spots, losing to Steamboat by only a score, but otherwise just wasn't super close here. And I think that part of that was just not a lot of push from some senior contributors here. Granted, you do lose Seth Markiecki, I want to say, and Cameron Benke here. They combined for 65 tackles on the season, but they do return a ton of guys here. Reagan Powell was the primary catalyst of the offense, passing for almost 500 and running for almost 200. He turned the ball over a lot. They're going to have to change that if they want to have a chance to win more games here. They also had 4 players who ran for over 100 yards. And I'm also looking at Ethan Sanchez, Angel Hernandez, and JL Houston, who all had over 100 yards receiving. So their entire offense basically comes back. And then you have the likes of Grayson Eisenhower, who notched a ton of tackles last season and returns for his senior season, along with the other 4 top tacklers here, Hernandez, Kuhn, Miller, all having over 40 tackles, and then Dylan Miller, who pulled off 5 interceptions here. And let's go ahead and look ahead to their season here. They start off against Steamboat Springs here. That's a game that could go either way, but I have Steamboat favored at home, obviously. They then play Cedar Ridge here. I actually kind of like Cedar Ridge in that game specifically. They then play Grand Valley here. That's probably this team's best chance for a dub. Fort Lupton, I think, is actually going to be kind of a sleeper program this year. And then in league, I just don't really see them pulling off a win in league unless Reagan Powell takes a huge step forward here. I just think that a lot of these teams are more consistent. Maybe they could beat Aspen, but as of now, I'm giving this team a window of wins of 0 to 3, honestly, and I'm going to have them projected to go 1-8 on this season here. Now, this next program that's in the same league, these are the top. This is the top team heading into this season as far as what they accomplished last year. What better way to talk about the recap than talk about the season and reminding everyone who the 2A state champs were? That was the Delta Panthers here, fueled by a core that was mostly retained for the past 3 years. It finally panned out for them in their first championship in over 50 years and did so in front of an awesome crowd over at Mesa's stadium. So they actually had that game out west because of conditions and trying to just keep it safe. So let's go ahead and talk about a lot of these class of 24 guys who are huge contributors to this team here, and that's going to go on for a second here. First off, Talon Hewlett and Romero ran for almost 2,400 yards and 25 total touchdowns here, but Hewlett's postseason run was insanely dominant. He had 18 total touchdowns on the season, and he just kind of ran away during the postseason and just kind of was consistently a Playmaker of the Week candidate or winner during the postseason. So he was very, very dominant down the stretch here. They also lose their top 3 receiving options with Brett LaHoe, Clayton Cryer, who combined for over 700 yards, and then Rylan Bynum here, who had 749 yards himself. And this trio altogether had 17 total receiving touchdowns. Lots of production to replace both in yards and scoring. Defensively, they lose a lot here. The top 4 tacklers on this team were Caleb Richmond, the aforementioned Talon Hewlett, Tucker Johnson, and Xavier Martinez. All these guys going crazy, flying around the field and making tackles. Tucker Johnson was a top 5 class of 24 edge rusher, going for 14 TFLs as well as 10 sacks. But that was not to take away or diminish Xavier Martinez's efforts, as he had 11 sacks himself, taking advantage of this stacked group that all just played off of each other very, very well. And this defense was one of the best in recent history, and part of that was the 28 turnovers that this team had, but they do lose 18 of those to the class of 24 walking across the stage. I'm talking about LaHoe's 6 interceptions. I'm talking about Hewlett's 4 interceptions, as well as a fumble recovery. Bynum, who had 2 interceptions, and another chunk of that being Tucker Johnson's 3 fumble recoveries. So in what world do the Panthers not only replace this, but as I talk through a lot of these other teams, project them to lose to Delta and keep them successful? Well, luckily, returning playmakers is the next segment in this total area here, and they have a couple of those. And, Ty Reed is somebody who's been getting snaps for a long time. He was arguably the face of Delta football these past 2 years, and definitely is this year. He had 37 total touchdowns last season and over 2,200 yards. His regular season dominance has been amongst the best of any player, not only in 2A, but just over the past few seasons. And his presence makes this team one of the best as a look to either repeat or come back really strong and be dominant on the 2A classification. In addition, here you have J.D. Kincaid and Jordan Frazier, I want to say, or J.D. Kincaid / Jordan Frazier here. That kind of tight end option might evolve into the number 1 option, looking at a 6'2" frame, caught a few touchdowns last year, so maybe increase those targets and that volume here. And then defensively, I think that you have some valid pieces and key contributors coming back. Jet Ryan, 4 interceptions and 4 pass breakups. Also returning to the pass defense is Horn and Frazier, who had 3 interceptions apiece, with Horn also notching on another 7 pass deflections. And then Rip Lockhart, who looks to continue to make an impact heading into his senior year as the leading tackler and TFL specialist who returns. And so I think about the culture that Delta has built. I know that a lot of what Tucker kind of talked about in his interview, which please go give that a listen, was just making sure that these young guys were going to be ready to continue to dominate, and kind of what the expectations were for him in his class of 24 when they were coming in young. And it's just going to be interesting to see that kind of passing of the guard and see how Ty Reed leads this offense as kind of a lone senior on that side, but a dual threat quarterback who's going to be able to do a lot of your offense for you. I also think that J.D. Kincaid or, Jordan Frazier, whoever you are, who was, listed at tight end and D end, I think that there's plenty of opportunities to pick up a lot of volume there and fill that vacuum. And then this secondary, I think, is going to be pretty good here. So let's go ahead and talk about this season and see how they're going to do. Now, a secondary is not going to help you against a team like your week 1 opponent, Palisade here. I actually do have Palisade favored here. Palisade, maybe their biggest doubters here, but I do think that this is a game that Palisade should probably win in week 1 over Delta as they try and figure some stuff out. They then play Gunnison here. This is an interesting game. This could be a close game. Oh, that could really go either way. But I'm gonna say Delta wins that one. They then have Rifle after that. Rifle, it was Rifle's only 2 losses on the season were against Delta. You think by now they would be due, especially in Rifle. But I think that for now, this rivalry will still belong to Delta for the time being. And then they have Alamosa as their last non-league contest. They do get the benefit of playing this at home, so I do think that they win that game. They then are at home against Basalt. I do have Delta favored in this game, but this is totally a game that Basalt can win, especially if they keep away from Ty Reed. They control the clock very well, and then they just don't give him opportunities to get the ball to some of his athletes who will be playing both ways. Middle Park, I definitely think Delta should win that one. I think Delta should beat Aspen. It's a huge, huge benefit that they're facing Moffat County at home here. This defense for Moffat County is going to be pretty good, I think. But, this offense just kind of has one key contributor coming back, and it's not at the QB position. So I do give that edge to Delta, and then Delta should beat Coal Ridge. So, I think at best this team goes 8-1, but they could lose a game to Gunnison, to Rifle, and to Basalt. I think that those are all 3 games that they could lose, theoretically, but I don't think that they go like 0-3 in those, to be completely honest. So I think at worst, this window of wins is 6-8 for the defending 2A champs, and I think that they could still be a higher seed heading into the 2A postseason. I'm going to have them going 7-2 overall, just to play it a little safe, but if they end up going 8-1, I totally see it. And this is a team to still look out for heading into next year. Who is at quarterback matters so much, especially on this level, and especially somebody who's a dual threat. That is imperative, and Ty Reed is him. Up next is going to be a team that's gunning for that spot in league here in Moffat County. Talking about last year, they dropped the opening game to Resurrection Christian 14-0 before rattling off 3 wins in a row, averaging over 30 points per game, before losing to Rifle in a tough 42-20 fashion. They then won down the stretch with the last 4, including a win over Basalt, and then pulled off a crazy win heading into the postseason as a lower seed, beating Elizabeth in a thrilling 31-21 W on the road that our co-host Juno Vigil was fortunate to see. And then an even bigger upset over Berthoud, who is one of the highest seeds in the entire bracket, 14-13. But the Magic finally ran out, losing 28-10 to Delta in the semis. Not a bad team to lose to, but let's talk about some of the guys that made that possible and how tough they are going to be to replace for the class of 24. Now, Evan Beaver, he was the quarterback, threw for over 2,400 yards and 20 touchdowns last year. That is going to hurt, as well as a lot of the skill position guys who benefited that he connected with. Bryant Carlson almost had 800 yards, scored 7 times. Hudson Jones went for 459 yards and 5 scores on passes from Beaver. And then you have Ian Champafy, the running back, the tight end, the receiver, the defensive end, the linebacker. I mean, definitely this team's MVP, who did literally anything you asked him to do. He caught for 598 yards and 7 scores. He ran for 662 yards and 8 scores on the ground. He notched 10 sacks on defense. He collected 66 total tackles and 14 for loss, being a two-way monster who elevated his play in the postseason. We talk about the postseason. Some guys don't show up. Sometimes the brights are too light, or sometimes the moment is too big. That was not the case for Ian Champafy, one of the best postseason risers we have seen in a single postseason while covering this sport. So just going to put that out there. Ian Hafey, an absolute dog, a literal bulldog for Moffat County last year, and going to be a tough replace here. He'd been getting time since his sophomore year, I want to say, maybe even a couple snaps as a freshman, but really left his mark, and he will be missed. We're going to miss covering him and talking about his impact on this Moffat County squad. In addition to him, though, you also lose Kenny Fredrickson, almost had 100 tackles last season, and made the most of those, as well as making an impact in other aspects here with a pair of picks and pass deflections. Anthony Jordan was another hog on defense, 11 tackles for loss out of his 64 total. Evan Beaver was playing on defense. This quarterback was getting his as well with 62 total tackles. And then you have Wyatt Dade with 9 TFLs, Hudson Jones with 5 for loss. And overall, this Bulldog defense graduates 10 of their top 12 tacklers. So why do I still have them being competitive? Well, this is a very well-coached team. This is a team that gets their younger guys in whenever they get a chance. And so we're going to have a lot of guys who have some experience as well as some high-end talent. I'm looking at Zach Hedman. He's going to be the, center point of this offense here. 500 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns last year, and defensively responsible for 75 tackles. But on the defensive line, you have Clayton Vanderslice here, who led the team, sorry if I'm butchering that, by the way, Clayton, in TFLs at 16 and almost 60 total tackles. And then Adam DeLay, who had 20 tackles and 7 for loss, could turn up as a senior, as well as sophomores Jaden and Jordan Anderson, who combined for 9 TFLs and have room to play at the junior year here for this team. And so talking about this squad here and looking at their schedule, they have Kennedy to start the season, then versus Steamboat Springs. I think that they should go 2-0 in these matchups before they play Berthoud. They do get the benefit of playing Berthoud at home, but this Berthoud team, I mean, they're returning a lot of talent. They should be one of the best teams in this classification. So I'm going to favor Berthoud over Moffat County initially, but this could be a huge statement win for them as far as catapulting them and affirming that they have a spot in the top 10 of power rankings. They then get the benefit of Grand Valley, Coleridge, and Aspen. I think that Aspen game should be closer than it was last year, but they should be 5-1 by this point when they start to play some of the heavyweights. Basalt and Delta, these three teams are going to tear each other apart, but I do favor those other two squads over Moffat County before they should end the season on a win against Middle Park. I think that they should go 6-3 this season, but do have a window of wins of, I guess 5 on the low end and 8 at the high end. This is a team that could definitely flirt with an undefeated season, but just has a ton of experience that they need to kind of continue to make progress as well as lead some of the younger guys in this program. And last but certainly not least, let's head over to Granby, Colorado to talk about the Middle Park Panthers here, talk about some MP football here. Last year, this squad was close to 500, winning 2 games with a close one over Estes Park before dropping 3 games to Steamboat, Arvada, and Denver Christian, struggling to score with a high of only 13 points across those 3 games. They then bounced back with a win over Jefferson before playoff teams Strasburg and Platte Canyon kind of mowed through them, but they ended on a W over Clear Creek to finish 4-5. As far as the class of 24 goes, they are losing Lucas Conger, sorry, however I'm saying that, Lucas, who is the lead back, going for 750 yards and 9 scores, being somebody to lean on, in addition to another 90 carries, courtesy of Schnurr and Gillist. Those two backs combined for 535 yards and another 3 scores. Garrett Gillis defensively was tied for the team high in interceptions and also notched a fumble recovery his senior year. And Tanner Schnurr defensively was the leading senior tackler, averaging nearly 7 tackles per game. And then Caden Ackerman led the class of 24 in Middle Park with 7 TFLs. So why am I still confident on this squad? Well, it's because offensively they have some talent coming back. Jackson Salyards impressed us enough to make our watch list heading into next season. And Marcus Bacias here, that connection is going to feed families this season as they connected 18 times for 3 scores. I think that that's going to be the key to their offense. They also bring back Jacob Trail, who's another target his sophomore year. He had 112 receiving yards and 2 scores, while also leading the team in tackles with 67 total. Salyards was second on the squad in total tackles at 64, but was actually tied for the lead in TFLs at 7. And Bacias was an absolute must on the watch list at safety with 4 interceptions, including 3 in a Playmaker of the Week performance. So I just really like their high-end talent here. I think it's enough to beat Estes Park to start the season next year. Now, against Steamboat Springs at home, that's going to be a tough draw, but one that they could win since a lot of the success that they found in last year's game could come back with them. Now, really interestingly enough, I like how many games this Rawlins team from Wyoming is scheduling as far as Colorado teams year in and year out. Now, this Rawlins team, looking back to last year, they are a 3A team in Wyoming. They went 3-6 last year, and in their game against Moffat County, lost big. Moffat County and Middle Park are 2 different monsters here. We will see how they do. That game can kind of go either way, but it does benefit that you are playing at home. They then play at Wheat Ridge. I don't think that's going to be a win. Versus Aspen, if they could pull off an upset, I think this is the one that's most likely because they do have an answer at quarterback. I don't think that they beat Delta. They should beat Coleridge, and then Basalt and Moffat County are just, that's a tough league to go into on the 2A level. And so Estes, Rawlins, and a Coleridge, I think that you win 3 games no matter what. Actually, make that 2 games no matter what. And I think on the high end, you beat an Estes, Steamboat, and Rawlins. You start off the season 3-0. Then maybe you pull off an upset against Aspen, and then you beat Coleridge. I'm going to say 2-5 being the window of wins for Middle Park here, but I see more of a 3-6 overall season here. I think that they did just slightly below with some of the new competition that they will be facing this year. And hold your tears. I'm sorry, y'all just going to have to wait until Wednesday for more previews here where we continue to talk about how a team did last year, the class of 24 contributors, who's coming back or who's coming in to make a big impact, and how does their schedule look and how will that look heading in. We also have our power rankings coming out every once in a while, as well as some graphics talking about how we did projecting teams' records last year. So thank you so much for listening, whether that is on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, YouTube as well. We upload all the podcasts to there, so please listen to our episodes anywhere you possibly can here. Turn on notifications on any of those apps. Make sure that you are following us on any of those, as well as our social medias, be it Facebook, Playmakers Corner, Twitter/X at Playmaker Corner, and then TikTok and Instagram at Playmakers Corner, where we have fun graphics, videos, highlights, and all kinds of fun content for y'all, as well as notifying you whenever new episodes are out. It has been such a pleasure to talk about all these teams. Continue to stick around as we have more previews coming out. I have been your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer, signing off.